Hello gang, Shambling Speedrun Git Ruffled Bricks here with another Worms Armageddon tier list. In this video I'm going to be ranking all 33 of the game's single player missions. The all missions any percent run is very much a favourite for me as far as speedruns go, and certain videos of this particular run have proven pretty popular in recent times. I'm going to be ranking these missions primarily based on how much fun I find them to speedrun. What makes a speedrun fun for me is how different the strats are from what a casual player would likely achieve in the game, along with how smooth the execution is, how enjoyably challenging it is, and how swag it looks. There's also an all gold version of the all missions run, which involves completing all of the missions with gold medals, and some of the strats on those missions are slightly different because of that. I haven't done that run very much at this point, but I will try and give some thoughts on those variations when they come up. So we're going to kick this list off with the basic training, which is being indicated here with a girder. Basic training is not a mission, so straight to the bottom tier it goes. Alright, we're not going to do that, but way back in 2017 there was a significant debate on speedrun.com about whether the basic training modules should be mandatory as part of the all mission speedrun. Although the 9 basic training modules aren't technically missions, you do have to complete them in order to gain access to the full selection of missions. One of the main arguments that was levied against having basic training in the run is that the basic training modules are kind of boring, which I can kind of understand that argument. If you're on a PB grind, then having to do intense target practice at the top of every run perhaps can get a little bit grueling, but from a viewer's perspective, I think basic training looks really good when it is done well. If you watch Madblack's PB for the all missions any percent run, for example, he pretty much nails every single shot in the basic training section, and it is an absolute sight to behold. While basic training doesn't really have the same spectacular ridiculousness of the main bulk of the missions, as a demonstration of precision it's second to none. I think it's a lovely little warm-up for the run, so because of that I am going to put basic training in the great tier. I figured someone's got to defend it. Going into the actual missions now, we start off with Mission 1, Pumpkin Problems. This is a pretty gentle introductory mission to the game, and I think its main function is purely to set up how the missions work. The object of this mission is to grab a crate from the bottom right of the terrain, so it shows you that the missions are going to be kind of task-based rather than being purely about blowing up enemy worms. In terms of the speedrun, there's 3 basic strats you can go for here, which all have their fair share of pros and cons. I tend to favour what I like to call the mine route, where I simply drop my worm onto a mine on the right hand side of the minefield so that they just get a nice little hole that they can use to get down to the crate in a more direct fashion. Unlike the other methods, this one's actually a 2-turner, but the turn that the enemy takes is very brief. The enemy worm just skips go because they can't do anything useful. And if you land on the mine at just the right angle, then it can actually blow you through the pumpkin stall can down right next to the crate, so you're ready to grab it straight away on your next turn, which can be a fun little boon. Then there's the rope around method, where you fling yourself across the minefield onto the right hand pumpkin, and then you use another rope to swing around the right hand side and then underneath. This strat requires a fair bit more skill with the rope, and there's a couple of particularly awkward bits of it, particularly in the bottom right, where you have to use your leftward momentum as you drop to affix your next rope. And then if you are extremely proficient in roping, you can go for the Big Mexi method. This is a rope trick where you fling your worm all the way across to the right hand side of the map from the first pumpkin you affix your rope to. And then because of the trajectory of your fling, the rope that you fire in midair will go backwards, meaning you can then attach to the right hand side of the far right pumpkin and then just swing underneath to the crate. This is a very difficult move to get into a speedrun, and I think one of the reasons that people didn't want basic training to be part of the all missions run was because they wanted to start on pumpkin problems so they could just grind and grind until they got a big mexi at the start of their run, which, given how little time it saves compared to the other methods on that mission, is a little bit petty. So yeah, it's pretty basic, this one. I don't particularly get excited about this mission, but it's fine. All of the strats have some notable flaw or another, so because of that I'm gonna put the pumpkin problems in the average tier. Next up, mission 2, we have Operation Market Garden. This is one of a few missions which has received some new strats very recently. A fair chunk of this year was spent routing Worms 2, which includes a lot of AI manipulations based on specific times that you do certain actions in the game. It was suggested by Mental, one of the original Worms Armageddon speedrun routers, that as the game's RNG seeds work similarly to those in Worms 2, it should be possible to find similar AI manipulations. And the new strat for this mission basically involves manipulating the AI into piling themselves in the bottom right hand corner. You spend the first 3 moves doing turns immediately as the turn time starts, which gives the same AI RNG seed every time you do it. And even though those moves lead to the destruction of your first worm, they're very much worth it, because you then end up with this lovely little congregation of worms in the bottom right, which Worm 2 can very easily pick off with one over-the-shoulder grenade. This is a 100% consistent strat that Mablak found, and it is absolute joy to do. That being said, you do have to get this strat right first time, because if you go into the silver medal threshold by failing the mission once, then the wind RNG actually changes as a result, and that means that the manipulations cannot be done in the same way. Before this strat though, Operation Market Garden was basically one of the most complicated missions in the game. It involved a series of pixel perfect grenade shots, and depending on how the AI behaved, you might have to resort to backup angles to ensure that you can kill the enemy off consistently. The sheer amount of angles you had to learn for this one was kind of ridiculous, but in a way I really liked that. It was a real test of your knowledge of the game to be able to react to whatever situation came up. It also had the first instance of knocking enemies onto a mine and having to deal with the fact that the mine detects the area around it every 10 frames, so the outcome of the worms being blown up by it could potentially go a number of different ways. There were definitely times when the RNG conspiring against you could be quite frustrating in this version of the mission, but nonetheless I did quite enjoy the challenge, and I sort of missed the fact that that's no longer the fastest strat for this mission. So yeah, this is a great demonstration of just how much you can manipulate the game in this run. Don't quite know if I would consider this to be champion, just because, as I say, I do miss the old strat a little bit for it, but I think it's definitely got to be top of the great tier at least. Next up, mission 3 here, we have All Quiet in the Library. This is the first mission in the any % run of the missions where you end up actually resetting it 4 times before you start. This drops you into the bronze medal threshold, which means that you actually get extra crates at the beginning of the mission that can help you out with a specific pixel perfect strat right at the top. One slightly frustrating thing about this is that the crates drop very slowly, and unlike in Worms 2, you can't actually speed them up by hitting the spacebar. But the droppage is worth it for the swag baseball bat triple that you're able to do on the first turn as a result. I have to say though that as good as the first turn is in this one, the rest of the mission doesn't particularly thrill me. There are 2 different main strats for this mission, which basically involve manipulating the grenadier in the middle to fire a certain way, and whichever way you go with it, you're kind of at the mercy of a field soldier being piled with at least one of the other worms on the map so that you can do a double damage airstrike on them. But the problem is, unlike with Operation Market Garden, garden, it's pretty much impossible to consistently manipulate the RNG in this in quite the same way. So the game kind of just decides whether the field soldier is going to end up piled with one of the other worms or not, and you basically can end up having an extra turn being added completely out of your control. What doesn't help as well is that the mission keeps on dropping crates in between turns, which the longer the mission goes on, the more excruciating the crate drops get as far as time losses go. Another thing that doesn't help is you have 6 worms in this mission, but you can't actually switch between worms at the beginning of the turn, so you have to cycle through them chronologically, and that can really make it irritating, as often the active worm isn't the nearest to the stuff that you need to do. And then in the all gold version of this mission, you don't even get to do that bat trick because the crate you use to deflect the worm isn't there, so it just ends up being something of a nothing mission really. So yeah, for me the bat trick is the only real redeeming feature of this mission, and I would say that's enough to put it in the average tier, but it's pretty low down overall. Next up, mission number 4, Cool as Ice. It's a nice little bit of plot to this one in that the enemy worm that you're trying to kill has taken the South Pole hostage and is threatening to blow it up. If only someone had told him that his dream would probably be realised automatically in 50 years' time. This mission has a nice little strat to it in that for the casual player it encourages you to do a tour of the crates on the landscape to find some weapons to kill off the enemy worm. But in actuality, just blowing up the crates above the guard seems to do the job a fair bit quicker. The big challenge on this one is trying to get a 1-turner on this mission rather than a 2-turner, as the flames from the crates won't always knock the guard in, so you may need to grab yourself a flamethrower crate with the jetpack and then use that just to knock them in. I did come up with a little alternative strat where you jetpack up onto the sleigh, and then once you blow up the crates you can just jump down onto the guard to knock them in if they don't go in automatically. Something to bear in mind with these missions is the game doesn't really care for the most part if your worms die on the last turn, just as long as you achieve your objective. As of very recently though, it does appear that Mablack has found a consistent AI manipulation that ensures that the guard always gets knocked in with the Uzi. Basically it involves keeping an eye on a skull in the background, and the moment it disappears behind an iceberg, that's when you fire the Uzi. This involves walking towards the Uzi crate rather than jetpacking to it, so because of that it can technically be slower than a 1-turner that you'd do with the jetpack. It is more consistent though if you're good at frame perfect tricks. But yeah, again, like the Pumpkin Problems mission, this is quite a basic one, so I wouldn't put this anywhere near the top of the list, but I think the AI manipulation does make it a little bit more interesting than it once was. So I'm going to put this, I would say, in the good tier. Somewhere near the bottom I think this will probably end up. Next up, mission number 5, do the Locomotion. This mission is kind of notorious around these parts for being the one that drove me into an apoplectic rage once when I was trying to do it on stream. The weird thing about it is this is actually a fairly easy mission in casual playthroughs. You're supposed to venture all the way over to the right of the terrain to grab a crate, and the girder strat that you would most likely use in a casual playthrough actually isn't that slow at all. It's a perfectly palatable route for this mission, but us speedrunners, us brazen masochists here, believe that it's much more important that we use a bungee to fling ourselves up onto the train. I have to say that this strat has gotten easier over the last year, and actually more fun as well, as a magic fire punch was found that gives you a nice little nub of terrain that you can use your bungee on. And actually being able to get some upward momentum off the side of this is pretty easy compared to the original version off the side of the tree, which could be absolutely excruciating if you didn't get the right momentum straight away. What's cool about the fire punch as well is that you have to do it at a very specific point on the jump, so that you have this little spur at the bottom of the fire punch tunnel, which enables you to jump up onto the nub. You only have a 3-frame window for it in the jump, which sounds pretty scary, but actually, as far as the rhythm of it goes, it's not that difficult once you get the knack of it. And then there are some fun little time saves as well, like staying on the spur at the end of the first turn so that the worm on top of the train just skips go. Or using skip go yourself when you land off the jetpack just so that you get to the main menu ever so slightly quicker. It's a nice mixture of big optimizations and small ones. And the bungee itself is a lot of fun to do if you can get it right, although you do need to be careful that you don't overshoot the traffic lights, as you will most likely end up in the sea. So yeah, this one's grown on me quite a lot over the last year, and I think I'm going to pop this one in the great tier, just below Market Garden. Next up, mission number 6, Sand in Your Eye. This is the first mission where you actually get to select Worm at the beginning of each turn, which I have to remind myself of constantly because I keep forgetting. Sometimes you forget that quality of life is a thing. It's also the first mission where the briefing notes on the menu screen are slightly misleading. They heavily suggest that the point of the mission is to collect a crate that appears on the pyramid after several turns, but actually grabbing the crate doesn't trigger the end of the mission. All it does is gives you a bunch of freezes you can use to protect yourself from the enemy. What actually triggers the end of this mission is killing all the enemy worms, and you can do that within 3 turns on this mission. This mission has 2 particularly fun speedrun strats in it that I rather enjoy. One of them is using the bazooka to pile 2 of the enemy worms together, followed by then using a longbow to shoot a mine onto them, which blows them onto a first aid crate, and then because one of them takes enough damage, woof, the other one gets wrecked within an inch of their life as well. It's not that easy a strat, and it requires a fair bit of precision regarding getting the bazooka and the longbow right, but it's very satisfying when it comes off. The other fun strat is using a grenade to create a hole at the bottom and then rope knocking the enemy into the hole. This is also a pretty tough strat to do because rope knocking is technically disabled in the missions, so in order to be able to pull this move off you have to wait until the retreat time of your turn finishes and then do the knock just as your worm loses movement. If you try and do the knock whilst you're still in turn time, then all of the worms are effectively velcroed to the floor, so they won't go with you. And if you do end up losing your worm as a result of getting this strat wrong, then it is a long old slog to try and be able to kill this worm off. So yeah, this mission's pretty cool. The strats in it are quite tough, but they're definitely rewarding and worth learning. I think this one can go in the great tier as well, and I think I'll put this just above Locomotion. Mission 7 next up, Not Much Room Out There. This is another Collect the Crate mission, and like many of the Collect the Crate missions, the crate appears in the bottom right hand section. It's the first mission with indestructible terrain as well, which doesn't really mean much in this mission other than these mushrooms might take a little longer to cook. Main crux of this one is you start with 1 ninja rope and nothing else, so you kind of need to get hold of a girder starter pack in order to help you get across the terrain. The strat I use for doing this involves resetting the mission once so that you get a extra girder starter pack crate right off the bat. Then I just pave over the sky because I hate sunlight and swing all the way over to this teleport crate over here where I can teleport straight onto the required crate. There is also a much more dangerous, much more swag version of this which involves not doing the reset. Grabbing the girder starter pack crate whilst you're on the rope and then placing the girders across the landscape and swinging all the way to the crate within the 5 seconds of retreat time that you get. I have started trying to learn it, but honestly I think this one might take a while for me to bed into my repertoire. Other than that, this one is more or less the same as Pumpkin Problems. I think it's kind of a pretty basic mission. I think it's a little bit slicker than Pumpkin Problems, so I'm going to pop this one in the... I'd say the way I do it is average tier, but I think the way you can do it belongs in the good tier. Mission number 8 here, Big Shot, or as we like to call it, Big Frog. This mission has a massively misleading brief to it, as it tells you you have an infinite supply of shotgun bullets available, when actually if you look at the itinerary you've got more or less any gun but. We do have a little bit of archery in this one though, and the longbow is actually pretty frequent in its appearances in the early part of the run. It's obviously not powerful enough to kill worms off by itself, so we use the nearby mines to just bolster our offense a little bit. If you're particularly foolhardy, you can go for a strat where you use the longbow to knock one of the mines onto the left-hand worm, and if you've timed it correctly, then the explosion will do the requisite amount of damage. It's not a particularly easy strat to pull off though. You will under damage on a lot of occasions, and there's not a great deal of backup if that happens, so it's more of an IL strat, that one, than something you'll do in a full run. You have the first of 2 sub-pixel jumps in the game where you need to jump onto a specific part of the side of this purple mushroom and then nudge right and back flip up so you can get on there. This is a move that actually takes a fair bit more practice than it looks, as if you're not careful you can end up losing the turn by getting the jump wrong on this. So you really need to get a sense of how sub-pixels work in this game to pull this off consistently. The second turn is where a lot of the fun is on this mission, as once again you're doing a fair bit of roping. You use an AI manipulation at the end of the first turn to get the right hand guard into a place where they're next to this mine, which means you can then use this mine and then the right hand mine to do enough damage to kill the worm off. And then you swing across to the left hand side and grab a granny from the crate. Really need to stop calling these old women grannies, like I've no idea if they had grandkids. And then you just unleash her onto the left worm to nag his head off. It's kind of a fun move to execute, especially if you manage to get the plop on the left hand worm. I think there's some cool stuff in this mission, but I think the amount of walking on turn 1 kind of is a bit of a drag. And the tech on this one just isn't as mind-blowing as I think many of the other missions can be in this run. So in the words of Pepe himself, I'd say this mission feels good, man. Next up we have Water Surprise. This is a mission I know has caused a lot of players grief when they first attempt this casually. Only recently, in fact, did I see a big streamer attempt the missions and spent what felt like an hour on this mission before giving up and drinking wine. As scary as this one is to do casually though, I have to say the speedrun version of it is something of a delight. You can bang this one out in 3 turns just with very efficient use of the tools that you're given. The first turn basically just involves using your longbow to knock the 2 mines off the side of the Eiffel Tower, and Psychotropic found a wonderful strat for this where you do the top one first and then you shoot the bottom one in a way that the mine actually hits your worms but doesn't kill them off. Both of these shots are consistently very easy to line up, so it makes the first turn on this kind of effortless and enjoyable. You can also just play the shots by eye on this turn, which can be a little quicker, provided that you don't mess them up. As someone who has messed those up a lot, I tend to prefer the psychotropic version. The second turn I would say is the hardest part of this mission, where you place the girder vertically next to the Eiffel Tower so it provides a deflective surface so that your worm can jump their way up. This one can be difficult because you need to be careful on where you place the girder, and the visual cues on this aren't especially obvious. So if you're not vigilant, you can end up placing the girder slightly too close to the Eiffel Tower, which will stop you from being able to climb, or alternatively it might be too far away and so the deflections don't work properly. Then finally, once you get to the top, you grab the aqua sheep. The way you're supposed to do this mission is guide the sheep under the water so that it kills the general off. But actually, a lovely little shortcut you can do is you can just send the sheep down and then deactivate its flight so that it falls straight back down again and blows the general into the water using the large explosion. So you've got 3 moves in this that basically make a complete mockery of everything this mission tries to scare you with the first time round when you play it, and that's why I love it. Because yeah, in terms of what this mission can achieve in the speedrun, I think this one has to go up into the champion tier. I think the speedrun route for this is nothing short of a revelation. Next up we have Jurassic Worm. This mission is a one-turner and it's another fantastic, spectacular strat for cutting to the chase on this one. This is a kill the leader mission, so unlike in other missions you only have to kill one specific worm, which is the one underneath the dinosaur's legs. If I was tasked with protecting a high-ranking military captain, then that's probably where I'd put him as well. Your main tool for getting down to the captain is a mole bomb, which you can find in a crate on the dinosaur's head. Whilst you're on the rope, you release the mole into the air so that they then dig down through the dinosaur's torso into the captain's section. And as that's happening, you also set off the rightmost mine at the top so that it knocks the mine to the left down the mole's tunnel and then knocks the captain into the water. This is a trick that takes a little bit of practice to get the timing of, and there are several ways in which it can go wrong if you're not careful. The main one is that the mine won't end up going all the way down the tunnel and just gets cold feet about a third of the way down. Alternatively, if you're not careful, you can set the mole bomb off too far to the left, which will mean that the mine won't actually hit the captain. But because this is a one-turn mission, then it's a very quick reset if you get this wrong, so you can just keep on trying it over and over again, and it's generally quicker than trying to carry on with the mission if you get the mission wrong. So yeah, this strat, very clean, very effective, very fun to do. Kudos to Mental for finding it way back in the day. And yeah, this is another mission that I enjoy doing a heck of a lot. I think this one also goes in the champion tier, and I think I'm gonna put this one just above Water Surprise here, because I think this one just has more of a smooth, efficient feel to it. Next up, we have Chemical Warfare. After Water Surprise, this is the second mission that makes the indestructible terrain a real feature. Although in this one, it's slightly more awkward in how you're supposed to tackle it. The object is to kill all the enemy worms off, but most of them are holed up within these rather thin bits of terrain. So it's about using little things like fire punches to permeate the indestructible terrain and kill off the low health worms. In the casual playthrough of this, it's highly suggested that you use the skunk to weaken the enemies within the terrain, but obviously, as I discussed in my deathmatch tier list video, skunks are not a particularly quick action weapon. So what's involved in this one instead is a lot of AI manipulation. You basically spend each turn ensuring that your worms are positioned as specifically as possible so that this major who's in the center moves all the way to the right of their section. Then if you've reset the mission once, as we do in the any percent run, then you use this dynamite to kill the major and this other worm off. Every now and then though, you can get a manipulation on the major where they actually do an airstrike on this field soldier here, and if you're lucky you will get a kill on them, which will save you a turn. There's also a slightly scary turn early on where there's a chance that your left-hand worm can get killed off by a rogue grenade from the enemy. And if this happens, you do kind of need to change the way you approach the mission as a result, which can be kind of irritating, but if you're on form, then you can deal with this fairly well. Another thing I like as well is the gold version of this mission does have a fairly different route to it to account for the lack of dynamite. It's not quick enough to replace the dynamite strat in the any percent route, but it does work well enough to fill the void that the big red stick leaves in its absence. Overall though, I think this mission is kind of a little awkward, and there are definitely certain turns that can leave you vulnerable to a reset if they go wrong. So as technically interesting as this one is, I wouldn't say this was anywhere near my favourite of the missions to do. I think I will put this one at the bottom of the good tier. Maybe just below Not Mushroom. Next up we have No Substitute. This mission has the prestige of having the first wonderful Holy Hand Grenade strat. It's a lovely little set piece where you drop the Holy Hand Grenade next to the artillery and it blows them up onto the palm tree, whilst it also blows your worm to the left so they knock a worm into the water. And then artillery takes so much damage from the Lord that they end up knocking the adjacent worm into the water as well. So you get a lovely triple kill, or Holy Trinity as I like to call it. Once again, it does take a while to figure out how to get the Holy Hand Grenade in the right position. It is very brittle and the slightest mistake will result in you overshooting the left-hand worm. Sadly, the second turn doesn't really live up to the lofty bar that's been set by this first turn. You basically use a shotgun here to kill off the 2 remaining worms, which the first shot is kind of long distance, so it does look pretty cool. But you then have to jump all the way across to the second worm, which is a little bit of a slog. On some occasions, the higher worm can end up killing themselves off by getting a rogue flame in the face. And if that's the case, you can use a bazooka or a homing missile to actually knock the worm on the island into the water instead, which does save a little bit of time. It happens so rarely though that I always forget the angle of the shot when it does come up. On the other hand, the RNG can end up going the other way, and the worm on the palm tree can end up knocking your second worm out of position, which does make the shotgun stuff a lot harder. These instances are pretty rare, but they are frequent enough to not really feel like you can get too cozy with the mission on this one. So yeah, I'd say this mission is half swag, half slog, and because of that, I think it goes in the good tier, but I'd say because of the swag in it, this one goes pretty darn high in the good tier. Next up we have Who Let the Floodgates Open. This one's very much a mission of 2 halves. The first half of this one is pretty scripted, and then the second half is a lot more thinking on your feet. It starts with another sub-pixel jump up a steep surface, which has a few fun little movements you can use to get this consistent. And then it has the first instance of a max bounce grenade, which is something that you rarely really get to use in other speedruns of this game, like Deathmatch for example. But here it gives you the perfect angle to be able to knock these secret agents down into the drowning threshold of this mission, which is the main source of kills that you're going to use. You have 2 worms in this mission, but you sacrifice worm 2 because their position just ensures that this nearby worm here ends up walking into the drowning threshold as well. Where this mission starts getting a little more tricky is once the secret agents on the left start moving, because there is a number of actions that they can undertake, and you kind of need to adjust according to what they end up doing. The one right at the top can either skip go, or they can try and fire a bazooka up to the top left, which will occasionally blow up the crate next to them and knock them down into the lower section. Or they can end up teleporting, which can end up being an absolute hemorrhoid to deal with, depending on where they choose to beam into. If you're lucky, they'll stay somewhere on the left, or they may even end up going up onto the girder that you use to get up to this worm here. If you're unlucky, however, then they can end up teleporting all the way over to the right. Sometimes they will even go underneath these cables here, which can be absolutely appalling. It is so difficult to get anywhere near them once they start doing that, and the best you can hope for is that they teleport back out once they realise the error of their ways. The other thing you want is you want the secret agent on the far left to open up a way in so that you can get in and kill them. Sometimes they won't do this, other times they will collect the first aid crate just by them, which will give them extra health, which makes them a little harder to deal with. But there's a bunch of different baseline strats that you can use to try and get rid of them once you have dealt with everyone else. You can use the grenades to try and plop them down in the bottom left hand corner, or you can use the minigun to blow up the first aid crate and get them to take extra damage from it. You can also use a longbow as well if one of the secret agents has ended up on the lower platform, as that can get them into the water pretty nicely. So yeah, the latter half of this mission can make this one pretty damn scary when you first start running all missions, and it definitely takes a while to get a sense of how to do it consistently regardless of the outcome. I do quite like this one, but it can also be a bit of a pain, so I'm going to put this one in the good tier, but I think pretty high in the good tier due to the unique challenges it provides in this run. Yeah, I'm going to say top of the good tier for this one. Next up we have Super Sheep to the Rescue. I think one of the most disappointing things about this mission is that they haven't done a custom terrain for this one, so they've just made it out of the farmyard terrain, and it looks pretty ugly compared to most of the other missions, so immediately that puts me in a bad mood about this mission. I also just don't think the task on this mission is particularly engaging. You have to guide a super sheep through the bowels of the British countryside in order to get a fire punch that you can then use to kill off the nearby enemy worm. This enemy worm is of no threat whatsoever and just waits there patiently until you get the task done, so there's not a huge amount of stakes in this one, other than I think you might possibly run out of time eventually. We have a little bit of a speedrun strat for this one, where we reset the mission once so that it spawns a slightly nearer crate, which does make the mission easier, but it is also faster, so it's worth the trade-off of the reset. You can get an even closer crate as well by resetting the mission 4 times, so you're in the bronze medal threshold, but with that many resets you are then basically negating any benefits that you get from having a nearer crate. Unless you really struggle with super sheeping, in which case I would recommend it. But yeah, basically all there is to this one is just guiding the super sheep around the maze, and that's it. Also, when this game first came out, you didn't even have to do that, because the mission would accept you just killing yourself off as long as you killed the enemy off in the process. So you could just blow up a sheep where you stood and yeah, you'd be done. That has been patched out, and I've yet to hear a convincing argument for getting the original version of the game just so that you can get a quicker version of this mission in the bag. The best version of this mission I've seen is the TAS version, which basically involves the sheep flying through one of those holes in the terrain, which is the pixel perfect undertaking, and then also hitting the guard from the terrain underneath, which does just enough damage to kill them off without hitting your own worm. Which is unfortunately pretty much impossible to achieve on a human basis unless you are extremely patient. So yeah, this is the first mission where I just don't really have much of an affinity for it at all, and I just get it out of the way during the speedrun. So into the BS tier we go with this one, into the blood and stomach pills. It's not a mission that I have a huge amount of trouble doing these days, I just don't find it particularly interesting or thrilling. We're going full Donna Summer with the next mission, as we've got some hot stuff. This is probably my favourite strat in the game, and I'm not just saying that because it's one of the few I actually had some input into routing. The task you have on this mission is to kill off 3 enemy worms who each have 300 HP. Which sounds like a tall order, but you can do this all in 1 turn. It involves the biggest explosion in the game, courtesy of a double damage holy hand grenade. And it basically involves putting the grenade in a specific position so that you kill off the lower 2 enemy worms in one go, and you blow your worm up to the highest worm so that their grave damage then knocks them into the water as well. This strat was known for years, but it used to have a much more difficult, less consistent setup to it, and after a bit of impatient grumbling from myself, I decided to look for a better setup, and I half found it, but it wasn't entirely consistent, and it was only through the developer dead code that we actually found out how to set it up correctly, which is you have to do a quarter pixel manipulation by backflipping into this worm before you actually lay the HHG. That basically guarantees that you get the strat 100% of the time, as opposed to only 52% of the time if you leave it to chance. And not gonna lie gang, that is the sort of elaborate tech that really gets my pulse racing. There are alternative strats you can do as well if you find the specificity of the holy hand grenade placement a bit too tricky. You can do it as a 2-turner using the airstrike to get the upper worm into the pile, or using a sheep to just get rid of them entirely. And then the holy hand grenade position doesn't have to be quite as forgiving because you just need to get the 2 lower ones into the water. But yeah, big explosions. Praise the Lord, gang. This is, I think, the most spectacular mission in the game, or one of the most spectacular missions in the game, and I personally find it a lot of fun to do. I never tire of this strat, so this one is going right at the top of the champion tier. Not sure if it'll be all the way at the top by the end, but it's definitely a big contender. Next up we have the first of 2 trouble missions in the game, Trouble on Mount Wormmore. I feel like the way I've said that makes it sound more like a Carry On film. Carry on worming. Wah, 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 wah. This is another kill the leader one, and I would say this is the least interesting of the three. This one is just about roping across to the left hand side and then doing a kamikaze to get the enemy into the water. You have to get the kamikaze quite specific in position because otherwise the high friction on this mission will stop them from going into the water. We mainly use what's called the crawl method on this one, which is that you get 2 ninja ropes from the crate. So you basically just use the first one to get past the first couple of mines, and then you use the second one to get all the way to the sign at the end. You can do a rope fling to get across to the left, but it's quite hard to get it whilst preserving the turn, and because of that the crawl method is a little bit more appealing despite the lack of swag. When I first learnt how to do this mission, I actually learnt how to do it the hardest way as well, which was the Big Mexi variant, which is a even more ridiculous turn to try and pull off consistently. But yeah, this one just isn't really that exciting at all. Like, it's fine, but like it's just very meh, this one. So I'm going to put this one right at the bottom of the average tier. Next up we have Chateau Assassin. Another mission that I would imagine many casual players of this game would rank as one of their least favourite missions. And much like Water Surprise, I am going to say that this one also fares much better if you learn the speedrun route. You use the select worm facility to basically get all your worms into a little pyramid at the beginning so you can get onto the top of this roof. And you grab this low gravity crate here, which you can only get if you reset the mission 4 times. So this is another bronze medal mission, this one. The low gravity ability though basically unlocks another giga swag move in the run where you place a worm on top of the oil drum, and then having grabbed the fire punch crate from the top of the building, you then use that to launch your worm all the way over to the right hand side, knocking the general into the water and achieving a victory, given that this is the 3rd and final kill the leader mission. This is another strat that I just never get tired of performing or watching, as it's just an absolute joy. Although having said that, I think the older version of the strat where you jumped on the oil drum and then punched it as you landed on it was a little bit more impressive to watch, but it was also much less consistent, so the updated version is very welcome. In terms of the all gold variations on this mission, I would say these are actually pretty cool as well. There's one that involves batting a mine onto the upper worm, which I have to say I've never really managed to pull it off myself, but it does look very cool. Alternatively, you can also just bat one of your worms onto the captain, which requires a little bit more setup, but it is, once again, pretty fun, pretty simple. But yeah, this is another glorious mission in the run. I say this one goes in the champion tier. I'm going to put this one just below champion, I think, as this has a little more elaborate setup to it, so it's not quite as fun as just roping straight to where you need to go. Next up we have Rescue Agent Dennis. I remember this mission kind of annoying me when I was a teenager because I had no idea who Agent Dennis was, and I didn't like the idea of worms that I'd carefully named being called up to play some other Johnny. Turns out Agent Dennis is actually John Dennis, who was head of design at Team 17. And presumably the object of this mission is to protect John Dennis from the rest of Team 17, who are angry with the new design he's given to the Team 17 officers. Yes, they look nice, but the parking facilities leave a lot to be desired. I think this mission can be one of the more fun ones from a casual perspective because it's the one where you get the most weapons in it out of all the missions, including some very high powered stuff like the banana, old woman, minigun, flamethrower. For the speedrun, this one is a little bit tricky as it involves keeping an eye on what's going on. The main limitation on this mission is that you only get 1 ninja rope, which, given how spaced out everyone is a little bit of a handicap. The main structure of this mission is you start off with a grenade to knock the 2 worms on the left in. There's an AI manip we try to do where by jumping in a certain position it does increase the chances of Assassin knocking themselves down into the E part of the Team 17 logo, which definitely makes the end of the mission quicker, but it is not guaranteed. Then it's about trying to figure out when to use the napalm strike to get the middle worms off of the M, because you pretty much need right wind to guarantee that this move will go smoothly. Then there's also a pixel perfect homing missile you need in order to knock the 2 worms on the right into the water, and once all that's done you can use a banana trick to kill the 2 remaining worms off immediately. This will still count as a win because even in a mission titled Rescue Agent Dennis, you don't technically have to rescue Agent Dennis. I do quite like the fact that you have to pay attention to this one to check which way the wind's going, and sometimes you won't actually get the right wind for the napalm strike, so you'll have to rope up and use a dynamite instead, which is less ideal but at least gives you a little bit of variation on the mission. The thing I dislike about this mission a lot is the crate drops. The crate drops are completely random, and every now and then they can fall in a position that will just completely mess up whatever shot you're trying to do. Still, if you do get a crate, it can be very useful as it will give you a select worm, which means you can choose between worm 1 or... oh, never mind. You can also get a double damage crate by resetting the mission once, which isn't really necessary for the solution, but if you want to throw a double damage banana bomb into the air and hope for the best, you do you. So this mission is decent. It's not one of my favourites. I think, as I say, the crate drops can leave a lot to be desired, as can the variability of the assassin's behaviour. I think I'm going to put this one in the good tier, just below no substitute, I would say. Actually, no, I take that back. I'll put that above no substitute, but below floodgates. Next up, we have the peculiarly named Horny Nuke. This is another one with a slightly misleading brief to it. There's a crate in the bottom left-hand part of the map which contains an Indian nuclear test. You are highly encouraged to grab it by the mission briefing, but actually it doesn't really do anything good for the mission. Using the weapon in and of itself doesn't actually drown any of the worms in their default positions, so you'd have to dig out some holes to be able to pull that off. At heart though, what this mission is a shopper mission, which means you start with very little resources and have to kind of farm them from the crates available, much like you're supposed to in Cool as Ice. There's been a recent update to the route by Psychotropic which has made this one a little bit quicker and a little bit more daredevil, as we don't collect anywhere near as many crates anymore. The original strat involved roping underneath the blue tentacle so that you collected some extra ropes, so you had 4 to do this mission in. The new method, however, only requires using 2 ropes, but you do need to use them pretty well in order to be able to pull this off. The big kind of stumbling block on this mission is you only get 2 seconds of retreat time after each move, which is pretty restrictive. So even on the ropes grenades that you'll be doing at the beginning of this mission, you do need to move pretty quickly to ensure that you land in the optimum position at the end of your turn. Again though, this one has some nice cool grenade swag in it, which just enables you to pile some of the worms together. You then got another holy hand grenade strat, which if you get it right can one-shot this artillery in the bottom left hand corner, but it's not guaranteed. Shout out to artillery, by the way, probably the most useless worm in the whole run. Changed my mind. The big centerpiece of this mission is using the banana to kill off the enemy worms all in this pile down here. And this is probably the most contentious part of the mission. Even though you don't have to collect the Indian nuclear test crate, if you do blow it up before you've killed all the enemy worms off, then that actually gets counted as a fail. And if you do use a loose banana bomb to kill the enemy worms off, then that can end up nuking the nuke. Wasn't that a Betty Boo song? If you're anything like me, you'll instead want to use a banana trick to kill the worms off, although having said that, they do all need to be close enough together to pull that off, so you may need to use the Uzi to do some pruning if the enemy worms aren't behaving properly. So yeah, I think I like the most recent version of the strat on this one, although there are some elements of it that I still find a little bit of a drag. The uncertainty of the holy hand grenade, for example. I think this one I'll put in the good tier, although I think I'll put it just above Agent Dennis. Next up we have Rumble in the Farmyard. I think this mission can be construed as kind of boring in the casual playthrough of this, as you don't get any particularly exciting weapons from it at first glance. I have to say though that the 4-turn version of this is, for my money, absolutely sublime. Like, this is a perfect example of a mission where the strats just kind of unfold bit by bit and each one influences the next, and the puzzle just comes together beautifully. You start off with a quick bazooka on the garden fork to get it to knock this mine onto the worm below, and as you're doing that you do a forward jump off the hay to land on this mine, so you take some health off your worm. On the next turn you get one of the few remaining rope flings of the run in order to try and cut out a fair chunk of travel in this mission. There are other big rope flings in missions like Mount Wormmore and Sand in Your Eye, which haven't really survived the routing process just because they're not consistent enough. But this one is pretty much an essential part of this if you want to do it quickly, and it's not too hard to do as far as rope flings go, but you do kind of have to keep an eye on what you're doing. Either way, being able to pull it off just looks absolutely swag. Once you get across to the well, you collect the crates, which contain a cluster bomb and dynamite. You use the dynamite to knock the artillery worm down with the captain in the middle of the well, and you phase into the worm using the rope as well to try and ensure that the two worms land in the same position when you get down below. By this point, your first worm should have below 43 HP, and then you use another quarter pixel manipulation jump here to set your worm's position so that they can then use this bazooka to launch them and the enemy worm into the aforementioned mine pit where the other worm is, using the hole that you made in the garden fork in the process. The grave damage on your worm then kills off the adjacent worm, which then kills off the adjacent worm, and then to top things off you hopefully have Assassin and Captain in the right position so you can do a cluster trick that kills them off. Every single turn on this mission is a banger. You don't get big explosions on this one, but technically this one is just fantastic to put together. There's also a less complicated 5-turn version of this if you don't quite feel you can keep all the spinning plates going on the 4-turn version, and it's not that much slower either, but it does miss out on some of the glory. But yeah, I think this mission is a real gem, actually. I really like doing this one a lot. I'm putting this one in the champion tier. I think this one is just great. I'm going to put it below... Actually, no, I don't know. I might even enjoy it more than the swag ones. I think I'm going to put this at the top of the champion tier because I just think when this mission goes well, it's fantastic. I don't think it quite gets the same swag points as these other missions below it, but I think in terms of what you are able to put together by doing this mission well, I think this one's so much fun. I love it. Next up we have Wooden Ambush, another title that I'm sure made more sense in Team 17's heads. This one's sort of a shopper mission as well, like Horny Nuke, but you don't really need to grab that much from it. There's a sheep crate that you grab using your jetpacks. The fact that you get several jetpacks on this mission is already a plus in my book, as it means mobility is not really an issue. We use the sheep to go through this very narrow gap here because for some reason sheep have less body mass than worms do, so they can fit through narrower tunnels easier. You use this sheep to blow out a big crater here for these two worms, and then you throw a grenade in just to get them into the water, like so. Owing to the slightly erratic nature of the sheep, there are some inconsistencies you may have to deal with in how this unfolds, and you may need to take another turn if the grenade doesn't get the two enemy worms into the water. A nice little manipulation on this mission is you have your leftmost worm as bait for the two leftmost enemy worms, which means that as you're working on the right hand side of the map, they will fire at your worm until they've made a tunnel through. If the right hand side plays up too much, then you may need to try and speed up the left hand side while you're waiting for them to open up. You can do this by using a jetpack to push a mine onto the tree, although it's not the easiest mine push to guarantee, and sometimes the mine will just ever so slightly roll away. And then you just use the jetpack to sidle up to where the two enemy worms are, and if you drop a 1-second grenade and just hold right, the grenade will actually blow you into the enemy worms, knocking them into the water. You do have to be a little bit careful on the grenade position, as if you're too close then one of the enemy worms will take damage from the grenade, and their recoil animation will mean they don't get knocked in, so you'll have to use a jetpack from one of the other worms to get over there and deal with them. So yeah, this one's a little fiddly and maybe not as guaranteeable as some of the other missions, so because of that it's not really one of my favourite ones. But there's some nice fun things going on in this mission as well, so again, this one I would put in the good tier, and I think I'll put this one a little bit lower down. I'm going to put this one just above the Big Frog. Next up we have Go Bananas. This mission, I would say, contains one of the hardest strats in the game, and I am going to go out on a limb here and say I do not consider this to be one of the more fun strats. It's fun to watch, certainly, when it goes well. The object is to get a crate on the right-hand side of the map, and you don't have any real good mobility weapons at this point in the mission, so you just drop a grenade at your worm's foot and then you do a more or less frame perfect jump as the grenade is about to explode. If you get that right, the grenade will launch you up and over the banana so that you are then in a very good position to just blowtorch through the remaining banana and get to the final crate. I have to say though, this strat is particularly difficult and there's not any really good comparable alternatives to it as far as speed goes, so you're kind of stuck with it. You also only really get 5 attempts to do this strat immediately from a fresh team, as once you go beyond 5 attempts, the game starts putting a double damage crate on the stalk of the grapes, which means that if you try and do the grenade trick whilst having double damage, you'll basically end up as a smoothie. You also may be forced to do one of the backup strats in this mission, such as baseball batting your worm over the banana, which in fairness isn't that bad an alternative if you can't get the grenade trick down, but I don't really like doing it. It's just too slow for me, you know, but like the fast strat is also really annoying. There's a lot of things about this mission that just irritate me, if I'm honest, so yeah, this one I'm going to put in the blood and stomach pills tier, although I'm going to put it above the Super Sheep mission just because at least the strat is kind of swag when it works. Next up we have the Drop Zone. This mission, much like Super Sheep, uses default terrain as well, so because of that it's not a particularly fun mission to look at. The object of this one is to parachute all of your worms down onto the islands that the enemies are stationed on and use suicide bombers to blow them into the water, along with one fire punch, just so you've got a safe worm at the end. This is not a particularly efficient strat in a world that contains RNG wind, so we actually just reset the mission 4 times, giving us a shotgun crate, and then do some pixel perfect shots on the enemies instead. These shots can be definitely quite tough to learn, but there's little terrain markers you can use to set up the angles for you, which is mostly what I do when I do this mission, and it does make it easier than trying to find the right notch with the sky as your background. With the first shot as well, you want to try and go for a fairly frame-specific timing on it so that you actually knock one worm so that they kill the adjacent worm off as well. You've got a fairly broad selection of frames to get this shot right. It's apparently around 7 out of every 10 frames where it will work, but best way I find doing it is just waiting until the second on the timer changes from one to the other and then just going straight for it. Then you've got the lower angle shot and a jump off the terrain just so that you can knock the lower worm in. So the fact that you can kill off 4 worms on the first turn definitely looks pretty banging. If you don't get the double with the first shot, then you can just fire another shot in the same direction and it will be fine. You will have to add an extra turn in order to float down and use the fire punch on the lower worms, but that's not really too bad as far as cleanup goes. Shooting the two worms on the far left is a much more difficult proposition just because it's a little harder to get the notches right, and sometimes the terrain can get a bit mangled by the bazookas the enemy fires at you, so you need to have a few different ideas of positions that will work for you in terms of firing your shots at the enemy. I have to say that the all gold version of this mission is a little less thrilling, given that you do have to use the parachutes and the suicide bombers to kill off the enemy. Although that said, there's still a couple of doubles that you can get. Good thing about the wind on the first turn is it is consistent when you're doing the gold mission, so because of that you do have enough wind to float all the way to the left hand side of the map, provided you take a little rest stop on a island beforehand. You can then use a girder to set up a nice suicide bomber double on the two leftmost worms. So there's still a few interesting things you can do on this mission without the shotguns. So yeah, the shotgun tech on this is quite fun, at least for the first turn. I think there's just a little bit too much that can kind of go slightly awry on this one. So I think I'm going to put this in the good tier, and I'm going to put this... Actually, maybe we'll put it above no substitute, I think. Like, because, you know, there is some swag to be had from the second turn on this one as well. It's just a bit fiddly. Next up, we have Countdown to Armageddon. Yeah, this mission has the most plot out of any of the missions in the game, so as far as getting some lore going, then it's pretty good for that. There's a politician in the middle of the map, an NPC with a extremely voluptuous hat. The object is to protect the politician not just from the surrounding enemy hordes, but also from a meteor shower that happens in several turns' time. The intended way of doing this mission is to use a bunch of girders to create shelters for the VIP, and I did use this route a little bit when I first started speedrunning, and I used to bat the VIP in between these two buildings here for maximum protection, which I have to say is a little fun knocking a politician around. It's alright, YouTube can't demonetize me, I'm not big enough. However, the real speedrun route for this is to just kill off all the enemy worms long before the Armageddon arrives. The way that you kill off the enemy worms in this mission is you basically plop the ones who are at the edges of the map, and then you pile the ones in the middle so that you can kill them en masse. The main means you'll use for this is a baseball bat to get all of them together so their grave damages can kill each other off, but there are variations on the RNG in this mission that can result in that not being a viable outcome. So other things like cluster tricks or shotguns may come into play that way. One of the ways this mission irritates me is that every now and then the AI, just apropos of nothing, will knock the VIP into a pile with the enemy worms. And if that happens, that is an instant reset, because there is no way you can extract the VIP from the enemy worms without killing them off. For what it's worth, the enemy do mostly try and avoid hitting the VIP, it seems. Like, they don't tend to aim shots directly at it that often. But every now and then, it just comes out of nowhere and it is infuriating. PB pace run down the toilet immediately. Another thing that's irritating is this major gets knocked out of position quite often by the shot that the enemy worm does on their first turn. And there are sort of ways around it, but they're not especially easy, so it's just a bit of an extra slog. And then with the baseball bat strat to get all of the worms over into artillery's pit, there's often quite a notable chance that the grave damage will just knock artillery out of the pile anyway, and you'll have to do an extra turn to kill them off. Which, given that artillery worms are stationary worms, he seems to have a remarkable amount of movement when he needs it. I think what's also kind of a downer on this mission is that this is the one instance where I think I kind of prefer the casual version of it, just because you get to see the Armageddon. Killing all the enemy worms off before the Armageddon is technically quite swag, but like in terms of what you actually get to see, there aren't really that many big eye-popping moves apart from maybe the bat. Maybe I just like a fireworks display, maybe I resent having to protect an elected official, I don't know, but there's just something about this mission that really rubs me up the wrong way, so I'm popping this one in the blood and stomach pills tier, although I think I'm going to put it at the top of it because I guess there's some interesting stuff going on there, but not enough for me to actually find this mission that enjoyable. Next up we have Mars Star. This is a unique mission in Worms Armageddon, as it is the only mission, if you ignore basic training, where you get to spam as many weapons as you like during the turn time. Because of this mission is over pretty quickly, but it's over in pretty fun style. The object is to blow up a crate on the right hand side of the map, and there's several ways in which you can do it, and I have to say I enjoy all of them. The method that I use was discovered by Dead Code, in which you use the alien tower just to your worm's left to line up your grenade shots and then throw a couple of grenades to the right, and then while they're in the air you do a little bit of pong by using the first girder from your girder starter pack to create a deflective paddle to knock the grenades down towards the crate. You then cancel the rest of the girders from the pack and you skip go just to get to the menu quicker. It's another one of those lovely succession of moves that I just never tire of doing. There's just something really satisfying about the sequence of movements that you do. Plus you have to place the girder pretty quickly and fairly accurately as well, so that the grenades actually do deflect rather than bounce underneath it. Before this strat, the quickest one was throwing a couple of petrol bombs over to the right so they would create a crater, which would stop your two follow-up grenades from bouncing into the water, and then they would just destroy the crate as they settled. This one was really fun as well, as it was the only time you got to use petrol bombs in the run, and you're using them in a kind of unorthodox way. And then the more casual version of the strat would be to lay a girder starter pack across the map and have a sheep go along and use that to blow up the crate. And I had to say, even that I found pretty enjoyable, because you had to get girders in the right position to ensure that the sheep would be able to travel along that far. And then timing the sheep's explosion as well, so you don't have to use any follow-up weapons to destroy the crate. That was a nice fun challenge as well, I like that. So yeah, this one's another really good one. This one goes in the champion tier for me. I think I am going to put this one above Jurassic Worm and below Chateau Assassin. Next up we have Mad Cows. This is a strange mission, this one, in that it doesn't really have that much of a gimmick behind it, other than you only get 20 seconds per turn, so you do have to do things fairly quickly. There was an odd little glitch with the original release of this game as well, in that one of the worms would be randomly positioned on the map rather than in a consistent position, and there is a part of me that would be interested to see what it would be like running the game on a completely unpatched release, just to see what would happen in that instance. As it stands, you've got a decent supply of weapons on this mission, but only one of the shots I would say is particularly interesting as far as swag goes. There's a double kill you can get with the grenade on the cow on the right hand side, where you use it to launch your worm into the worm lower down, and that just knocks them into the water. It is dependent on the frame detection on the mine as well as the RNG of the flames from the oil drums, so in rare instances the enemy may survive that shot and you'll need to do an extra turn to get rid of them. Alternatively, your quarter pixel position may be wrong as well, and you can end up not getting the jump right to set up the double kill, so that also will require backup. The other two turns are just basic plops using the grenade and a dynamite, which I have to say, I do like the fact you get to use dynamite hatting in the run. Hatting is basically a technique where you use the number of pixels you've nudged along a worm's head to discern where to place a dynamite, so that you know what trajectory they will fly off when it explodes. So yeah, that's kind of fun, but otherwise I just find this mission oddly bland. Like, there's just not really any big hooks to this one. I guess this one's going to go in the average tier. I'll put it at the top because it's at least a bit more fluid to do than some of the others in it, but it just doesn't really blow me away as far as missions go. Next up, we have Bazooka on the Rocks. I'm going to come out and say that from a casual perspective, I think this is one of the worst designed missions in the game. It's passed off as an attempt to get you to work with the bazooka more and to try and use the wind to do harder shots to get hard to reach enemy worms, but it feels more to me like they just came up with this map with these yaks with their balls hanging out and they thought, well, we better use this for something. What really annoys me about this mission is the positioning of the enemy worms, particularly the captain in the bottom left. This captain is an absolute pain in the hole to deal with, and we actually reset the mission once to get a homing missile crate to drop, because that is pretty much the only real consistent way to get him. And even then, it is dependent on where the captain ends their turn, as they can end up in all sorts of places, including in a cave that they've made in the side of the rock formation. And if that happens, it's pretty much either a reset or pilgrimage, because getting over to the left hand side of the map is pretty limited, given that you have one girder that you can only place at point blank range, and you only have 30 seconds per turn, which makes travelling across great distances kind of infuriating. You've got a worm in the right hand corner who's absolutely useless, so you pretty much have to complete the mission before it's their turn, as you don't get to select worm in this one. On the upside, the wind is consistent on the first turn, which means you can get a nice consistent double on the two worms at the top left. Once again, you have to be up on your sub-pixel positions to be able to get it consistently, as if you're off by one sub-pixel, then the two worms won't land in the same position, and so the grave damage won't really work. And then there's the bazooka shot on the major, which you kind of have to learn around 4 different angles depending on what wind you get. And even if you do get the angle right, it's not necessarily guaranteed that you will get the kill on the major, as sometimes the frame detection on the mine that they're supposed to hit can be slightly off. And again, that will probably require a slight pilgrimage to be able to get it off, given that trying to YOLO bazooka shots is an absolute nightmare. There is a nice 2-turner that Mablak has recently found on this mission, but it involves a frame perfect AI manipulation whereby you fire the bazooka at a specific point when a star goes behind the terrain, and if you get it, then the bottom left captain will actually kill off the major for you, which means you can then use a specific bazooka shot to kill them off on the next turn. That's kind of cool, but again, because it's frame perfect, it's pretty difficult to get, and so if you don't get it, you just end up defaulting to the normal strat. And then for the gold version of the mission, you don't even get the homing missile as a backup, so you pretty much have to get the frame perfect shot or pilgrimage, and that's pretty joyless. So yeah, I don't really dig this mission at all. I might put it above Super Sheep to the Rescue, just because I think there's a little bit of interesting tech in here, but like this is very much a get it out of the way mission for me as well. Next up, we have Stolen Goods. This mission feels like an interesting relic of the past, given that Microprose have stopped being the publisher of the game for a few years now. I guess Team 17 haven't got around to finding another shape that works for this mission. The plot of this one is there's some high-powered shipments of weapons that have fallen into enemy hands, and you need to get them back so you can actually kill them off. I quite like the start of this one where you have to rope underneath the pros part of the logo, because it's a nice little shortcut that teenage me would have been absolutely terrified of. Then what you do is you blowtorch into the O of the micro and you grab the French sheep strike, and that is pretty much your main weapon for doing the rest of the mission. If you're really good at roping, you can actually rope up between the two mines at the middle of the Microprose logo and then blowtorch into the O from above. The French Sheep Strike is a fun weapon and it does have a banging tune to go along with it, but it is quite prone to RNG. On pretty rare occasions you can get a quad kill with the French Sheep Strike, and that is fantastic when that happens, but most of the time you'll end up with one survivor from the strike, or occasionally 2, depending on the angle that you use. I do think the cleanup process can be kind of fun in this one, just because you never quite know what you're going to get, although there are definitely some outcomes that are just downright heinous to try and deal with. A little trick I use for this mission is I also reset it once as well before I do it, which means you get a homing pigeon crate that spawns on the right hand side, and you can use that as a backup if worm 1 gets killed for whatever reason, or if the enemy worm just requires slightly more damage. So yeah, this one's a decent mission, I think. Not amazing, but I think this one goes in the good tier. I'm trying to think whereabouts in the good tier it should go. I enjoy the rope and the sheep strike quite a bit, so I think I'm gonna pop this. Actually, I think we're gonna go with top of the good tier, because it's. Yeah, I don't mind this one at all. Even though there are some irritating outcomes in it, I think they are usually pretty fun to deal with. Next up, we have got Sinking Ice Cap. Bit of a misnomer, this one, in that the rising water level is not going to happen whilst you are doing this mission, and not really a factor in it at all. I enjoy this mission for many reasons. You've got ninja ropes in it, which means that you can get around the map pretty easily. You get to use the blowtorch as a credible offensive weapon, which is a nice touch. It's a 2-turner, so it's pretty short, and also it's an example of a mission where you have to learn how to use retreat time effectively. The first turn on this mission involves blowtorching the worm on the left hand side and then going through the tree and jumping 4 times so that you land on the right hand assassin's head. Timing those jumps so that you actually manage to get all the way over there before the retreat time is up actually takes some practice, because if you dilly-dally too much then the retreat time will end before you start the 4th jump. You kind of need to start the 4th jump just before the retreat time ends. This position then gets this wonderful AI manipulation where the assassin tries to drop an airstrike on himself. Your worm falls off the assassin's head, hits the nearby mine, and because of their low health they die immediately. The outcome of assassin's death then gives you branching paths depending on whether your worm ends up with 7 HP or less. Because if they do, then you can end the following turn by throwing yourself onto the worm below to blow them into the nearby mine. If they don't, you do a slightly slower but still kind of fun AI manipulation where you stand on the roof and just let the AI airstrike you, once again hitting themselves in the process. So yeah, the fact that you can cut 2 whole turns out of this mission through AI manipulation and a little suicide pact is a lot of fun. I think this mission is another one that I would put pretty high up. I'm just trying to decide if I want it in Great or Champion. I think just for the sheer ridiculousness of some of the strats in this, I think this one needs to go into Champion as well. I think I'm going to pop it just above Water Surprise, I think. Next up, we've got Aim Long, Aim True. This is another one that I really enjoy doing, I have to say. It's lining up all these grenade shots does take a lot of practice, but it's so rewarding when you get them right. I quite like the opening girder starter pack as well, just because trying to do those positions as quickly and efficiently as possible is a nice little challenge. You're basically setting these girders up so that you can then kill off all 4 of the enemy worms on the map within 3 turns. You do that by using the grenades to knock the adjacent enemy worms onto the middle ones so that their grave damage actually kills them off without you having to throw a single grenade at them. This is also one of the only missions outside of basic training to involve shots that aren't full power or just dropping a weapon in place. Because the grenade for the left hand worm, I just do this as a kind of 3/4 power shot so that it goes through the funnel we've created with the girders and knocks them in. I found that actually placing the spare girder you have at the top of this funnel, it gives you a little bit more leeway as to how you can do that shot. And then the final shot is a max bounce one, and it's always a big crowd pleaser, that shot. It's just a lot of fun to do. It's a difficult one to set up, but I kind of feel like a shot that good should be difficult to set up. So yeah, another lovely mission, and really enjoy it. This one I'm going to pop just above Sinking Ice Cap in the Champion tier. Next up we have Goody Two Shoes, a map that features 3 shoes, plus possibly one in the box as well. Unless, of course, you don't class a boot as a shoe, in which case, fine, perfectly accurate title. The big thing that bogs this mission down is the start of it. You start off in a very low cavern part of the terrain and you have to blowtorch to the surface to be able to do the rest of the mission. And depending on how you do the start of this mission, that can take 2 to 3 blowtorches, which just drags. I think the reason it annoys me so much is that the big move that you have to do to make this mission work occurs on the 3rd or 4th turn, in which you release the Aqua Sheep. You don't have enough weapons at the start to be able to actually kill off all the enemy worms, so you need to use the Aqua Sheep to collect some of the crates from the central section to be able to kill them off. And if you happen to get the Aqua Sheep wrong in the way that you don't get at least the Ninja Rope crates to be able to go over there, then that's a reset and you have to go through all the blowtorching again. Because it's an Aqua Sheep, it's sort of implied that you can launch the sheep from the cavern where you start and then guide it underwater and then up over to grab the crates, but although that is possible, you need a very specific set of circumstances to be able to actually kill off all of the enemy worms without going to the surface. There's a good task by Deadcode that shows how it can be done, and both Lex and Mablack have been able to reproduce this without the use of tools, so it's possible, but drastically inconsistent. Mablack has found an AI manipulation for this mission recently, which reduces the amount of blowtorches you need to get to the surface. By doing vertical jumps before you blowtorch, then you can actually get the enemy worms to blow a crater through to your blowtorch tunnel a turn early, if you get the timing right. And it doesn't really cost you anything if you get it wrong, so it's worth trying out regardless. Once you've finished collecting the crates with the Aqua Sheep, you can then plough it into an enemy worm to try and get a kill with them. For this, I like to use a technique where I reset the mission once, which gives us a napalm strike crate that lands near to probably the most difficult to kill of the worms. It's not mandatory, but it just gives you extra ammunition for blowing that worm up. Once that's out of the way, you just use some baseball bats and an airstrike to kill off the remaining worms. So yeah, I think the first part of this mission does drag it down significantly, although the AI manipulation at least helps a little bit. I like the sheep part of this, but the rest of it I can kind of take or leave, so I would put this mission at the top of the average tier, I think. Actually, no, I think I'll put it below Mad Cows, just because I think Mad Cows is just a smoother experience overall. This one can be a bit of a trudge. On to the penultimate mission now, with Trouble in Toy Store. Not the toy store, just toy store. This one has some cool shots in it. The first grenade shot that you use to kill off the 2 worms on the left is pretty much an essential strat to making this one go smoothly, and it looks cool as well, which is always a bonus. The second turn is kind of where my enthusiasm can wane a little bit for this mission, as it is a long distance cluster trick, which, although being a swag move, does have a myriad of potential outcomes that can occur. Ideally, you want it to knock the captain into the sniper and for them to both land in the mine pit and get one-shotted. If they don't get killed by that, you are pretty much then resigned to use a mortar, given that that is the main offensive weapon this mission gives you once everything else is used up. You'll know about my opinions of mortars from my deathmatch weapons tier list, and it's the same with all missions. I dislike using them profusely in this context. The problem is sometimes the mortars will just fail due to weak damage rolls or poor spread, so because of that you kind of need to end up going over there anyway, or using a homing missile that spawns a little bit later to kill them off. There are also some really awkward positions the captain can land in, like under the teddy bear's arm, which can be a real heinous position to deal with. Something to note about this mission is, alongside Countdown to Armageddon, it is the other VIP mission in the game where you have to protect a scientist from the enemy hordes. This I tend to forget quite often because, to be honest with you, with the strat we use, the VIP is hardly an issue. Yeah, they're poisoned and their health trickles down gently across time, but honestly, if you do everything right, then no one will get anywhere near them. You can even use a dynamite to get down to the assassin underneath, and the VIP won't take too much damage from it. Nice little feature of this mission is if you reset it once, you can get a bunch of extra stuff to help you out, including a holy hand grenade, which can be kind of nice. The downside of doing that is the game gives you loads of extra messages from base, which just slow things down a heck of a lot, so it's much quicker to try and work with what you've got. But yeah, I don't mind this mission actually. This one's got some fun stuff to it, so I think I am going to put this one in the good tier. And I'd say I'm going to put this pretty high in the good tier as well. I think I'll pop this just below stolen goods. Then the final mission in the game, Spectral Recovery. This mission is part of a grand tradition of the second generation Worms games in that it provides something of an anticlimax to the missions run. Although I have to say I've come to quite enjoy the anticlimax for what it is. The object is to stop a crate from falling into the water on the far left of the map. The casual version of this is just 4 minutes of blowtorching, and to be honest with you, it's a perfectly viable strat if you're first getting into this run, but the strat that I use takes a somewhat different tack. After a blowtorch on the first turn, you spend the next 2 turns just killing the enemy worms off. You do a max bounce grenade on the middle worm and a jump knock on the right hand worm. Then the left hand worm comes down to get you, and they do it with the most devastating weapon in the game. Just not very well. Then you use the blowtorch as an offensive weapon again, and you just knock them into the water without blowing up the oil drum. These are all very satisfying kills, and it's great to get them into the last mission of the run. But what happens when you kill the enemy worms off is you end up continuing the mission until the crate has been rescued. And the game gives you all of the enemy worms turned to be able to do this, so you just use those to blowtorch down to the girder, then blowtorch back up to the surface, pop the girder in place, and then just skip go until the crate arrives. It's a bit of a subdued ending to an otherwise riotous speedrun, but you know what? I actually have come to really appreciate that. Often in speedruns you don't really get that moment just before the run ends where you get to reflect on what you've just done, and I quite like the fact that you do with this. It's almost like a winding down ritual. In marathons, it's a good place to do shout-outs and all that kind of stuff, and yeah, I just like the tranquility of it. It's really grown on me. I wouldn't say I love this mission quite enough to put it in the champion tier, but I think I'm going to pop this in the great tier, just above Sand in Your Eye, just based on how it makes me feel at the end of a run. So yeah, those are my rankings. I hope you found this video informative and or entertaining, or at the very least distracting. Do you agree with these rankings? Do you disagree with these rankings? Are you completely indifferent to these rankings? Let me know in the comments below. If you're interested in giving the run a go yourself, there's a guide to it on speedrun.com, and it's a brisk read at a mere 100 pages. This run wouldn't be the run that it is without years of great routing from the likes of Mablack, Deadcode, Lex, Psychotropic, Peachy, Mental, and many others. So shout out to all of them. Thank you very much for watching. This video's over.